Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. Week 4 is upon us, and in this video, I will break down my research and strategy for the running back position in Week 4 of the NFL. As I have previously mentioned in my other videos, the scoring is starting to catch up with the projections. The best way I can show you this is by giving you a quick recap of Week 3. Going into the main slate in Week 3, the top 5 projected running backs were McCaffrey, Elliott, Barkley, Bell, and Cook. Now, the actual results were Ingram was number 1 with 38.50 points. Kamara was number 2 with 37.10 points. McCaffrey was number 3 with 30.80 points. Lindsey was number 4 with 29 points. And Cook was number 5 with 27.30 points. And in fairness, Barkley was actually projected number 3, and we all know what happened. He went down in the first half and didn't play at all, and now he's out 4 to 8 weeks. So with that being said, McCaffrey and Cook were actually projected in the top 5 and finished in the top 5. So that's something to look at moving forward. And when you're building your lineups, you want to consider those players. You want to still look for value, but again, the scoring is starting to catch up with the projections as we move further and further into the season. The numbers tell us a lot about what's going on. With the running back position, a valuable indicator for fantasy points is the expectation of points from total touches. For instance, in Week 3, Ingram, who led the way, had 20 touches. Kamara had 25 touches. McCaffrey had 27 touches. Lindsey had 25 touches. And Cook had 20 touches. All those running backs had 20 or more touches. Now, touches also include receptions, but it's worthy to note that it was 20 or more touches that they all had. I personally prefer to use the running back in the flex position to give me 3 running backs. And I like to project if I'm going to use 3 running backs, my goal is to get at least 65 or more total touches, and I'll show you why here in a minute. The running back position is more dependable from week to week compared to the other positions. And you're able to project this by looking at the touches, because touches also tell you how much percentage of the offense does that running back have. And with the running back, there's less involved in like a wide receiver or tight end, because a couple things have to happen. The quarterback has to throw the ball, wide receiver, tight end has to catch the ball. So with the running back, it's a little bit different, and those, as I mentioned, those numbers are more consistent. As I mentioned, touches represent fantasy points. In Week 3, for example, we find that the top 5 running backs averaged 1.39 fantasy points per touch. Now, what I did is I took the total touches and I took the total points scored between those 5 running backs, and I divided them. And I came up with the 1.39. That the top 5 last week, that's what they were averaging per touch. And also remember, that's relevant to everything. The scoring is relevant to everything. It factors in the touchdowns, the fumbles, everything. And touchdowns vary from week to week. When I'm building my lineups, I don't factor that in. I used to do that years ago. I would look and I'd try to build my lineup by trying to figure out who is going to score. I absolutely do not do that. If I get the score, that's a bonus, and obviously adds to the value of the particular position that I've selected. Now let's look at touches through the first 3 weeks of the NFL. Keep in mind, players such as Le'Veon Bell, who leads the way with 76 touches, won't be listed in this because I'm just building lineups for the main slate. And Le'Veon Bell this week, who leads, as I mentioned, leads the way with 76 touches, actually has a bye week. So the ones that are that I mentioned are specific to the main slate. Number 1 is McCaffrey. Through 3 weeks, he has 74 touches, 59 rush attempts with 15 receptions. Number 2, Chubb from Cleveland. He has 69 touches, 58 rushing, 11 receptions. Number 3, Dalvin Cook, 66 touches, 57 rushes, 9 receptions. Number 4, Marlon Mack from Indianapolis, 65 touches, 61 rushes with 4 receptions. Austin Eckler from the Chargers, 57 touches. He has 38 rush and 19 receptions. Fournette from Jacksonville has 57 touches. He's got 43 rushes and 14 receptions. Lindsey from Denver also has 57 touches. He's got 45 rushes and 12 receptions. Henry from Tennessee has 55 touches. 51 of those are rush attempts and 4 receptions. Carson from Seattle has 55 touches. He has 45 rush and 10 receptions. And Kerryon Johnson from Detroit has 53 total touches, which 48 are rushing and 5 receptions. Now, I broke this down even further by dividing the total fantasy points scored for these running backs by their total number of touches. And when I did that, I came out to a number that was different from last week. Those running backs had scored significantly higher. But the average for those top running backs in the touch category is 1.10 points per touch. Now, I told you I would tell you why I like to factor in, I'm shooting for 65 or more touches when I'm building lineups if I'm using 3 running backs, 1 in the flex. If I can get 1.10 points per touch and get 70 touches, and that takes into account, like I said, it's all relevant. It's the touchdowns, fumbles, receptions, everything. If I can get 70 touches out of them, that would give me 77 points. That's 3 positions out of the 9, so a third of my scoring is 77 points. And obviously, to compete in whether it's GPP, head-to-head, double-ups, whatever contest that you may be in, this would represent a third of my score, which puts me on my way to over 200 points, and I feel like that's definitely something that you need to do to compete, is to get over the 200 point threshold. The last 3 weekends have been, first weekend I believe it was 286 points, took down the Millie Maker. Second weekend was 231 points, and last weekend was 254 points, I believe. Running backs that receive a high number of touches represent a high percentage of their offense. With any position, I don't just use one number. That's just one thing that I factor in. Just like the very first thing that I do, as I've mentioned in all my videos, is I look at the Las Vegas lines, and I'm interested in the totals. I search for the games that have the higher totals because I feel that those games are going to have the players needed to do the scoring for those totals. Vegas isn't in the business of losing money, so those are good. That's a good place to start when you start building your lineups. And I do that before I look at any of the players. I want to see the lines. I'm looking in running backs. I'm also looking for home favorites. I'm looking for teams that are favored by a lot. So these are just a few of the things that I do when I'm building my lineups. But I factor all these in, and I narrow it down through the week. And if you've been following me, you know that on Saturday I put all this together. I let you know if I've added something, subtracted something, and why. And I use these players specifically to build lineups. And I don't MME, meaning I don't build 150 different lineups in tournaments. I put a couple in a lot of different contests. I don't have anything against people that are able to do that, but that's just not financially where I am, and I do this for fun. I want to win, and I put some time into the research, and I hope this research and strategy is valuable to some of you out there. As I mentioned in my recap video from week 3, if you would have used my players and it was possible to construct a lineup out of my players to outscore the eventual Millie Maker winner last week on DraftKings. Another number to consider with running backs is their particular matchup. How what are the teams that aren't performing well against the running back? Who's given up a lot of points to the running back position? Some teams funnel points to the wide receiver. Some teams funnel points to the tight end. Some teams funnel points to the running back because maybe their defensive backs are really strong, and the only way teams can move the ball or do some scoring is um, through the run game, and vice versa. Maybe they're really strong in the run game, so teams have to pass. So with the running back, I want to find the teams that are giving up a lot of points per game to that particular position. This week, the worst team against the running back position is the Miami Dolphins. They're giving up 37.3 points per game, fantasy points per game. This week, they face Eckler, who is also one of the top touch running backs. Detroit is second worst. They're giving up 27.6 fantasy points per game. This week, they face McCoy and Williams. That matchup scares me a little bit. I try to stay away from committees because it's hard to tell and who's going to get the ball. Head coaches sometimes go with a hot hand, and you really never know until the game gets going. And I'd rather have a running back that's getting all the touches and get my points that way. Indianapolis is third worst. They're giving up 26.9 fantasy points per game. This week they're going to face Jacobs from Oakland. The Rams are number 4, the fourth worst. They're giving up 26.5 fantasy points per game. This week they're facing Barber. Now this is an instance where, as I was saying, maybe teams can't move the ball through the air, so they have to do it on the ground. And the Rams have a pretty formidable secondary, so teams might think that it's a little bit easier to move the ball on the ground than to attack them through the air. Kansas City's the fifth worst. They're giving up 26.1 fantasy points per game to the running back. This week they're going to face Kerryon Johnson from Detroit, who's another running back that's in the top touches that I mentioned earlier. Oakland, they're giving up 24.9 fantasy points per game to the running back. This week they're going to face Mack from Indianapolis. Mack's another one that was in the top touch running backs. Denver, they're giving up 24.5 fantasy points per game. This weekend they're going to face Fournette from Jacksonville, another running back that's high on the list on touches. And lastly on this list, Houston, they are giving up 23.8 fantasy points per game, and this week they're going to face McCaffrey, who is one of the top running backs when it comes to touches. Using these matchup numbers and cross-referencing, I can highlight the following, and I did some of that while I was reading those off. Eckler, Johnson from Detroit, Mack from Indianapolis, Fournette from Jacksonville, and of course McCaffrey. All those running backs have favorable matchups this weekend. As I mentioned, touchdowns are very inconsistent. You can't depend on them, and they cannot be factored into your projections. If you get them, great, but touches and receptions, those are the things that you want to factor into with when you're building your lineups and choosing your running back. Now, other things that you want to consider are the running backs that are receiving the ball close, inside the 20, and in particularly, like, who's getting the goal line carries? Who's the running? Are they splitting it? Are they is the quarterback vulturing the carries on the goal line? And these running backs I've identified through 3 weeks have received the highest number of carries. This is inside the 5-yard line. Ingram has received 5 carries inside the 5. Lindsey, 5 carries. Montgomery, 4 carries. Frank Gore from Buffalo, 4 carries. Eckler, 3 carries plus 1 reception. And he's been 100% of their inside the 5 plays. Now, the numbers seem low, but in all actuality, plays inside the 5 aren't that prevalent in every game. It's not like you're going to get 20 plays inside the 5. Not saying that it can happen, probably not going to happen, but when these teams are down here, these are the players that they're turning to, which would lead you to be able to depend on them a little bit more for the touchdowns. McCaffrey's received 3 touches inside the 5. Sammy Michel from New England's received 3. Thing about him, he's received 3, but those 3s are only 50%, and New England's very, very iffy with the running back. I mean, Burkhead gets carries, White gets carries, Devlin gets carries. So Michel's received 3, but that's only 50% of the total. So take that for what it's worth. Henry from Tennessee, he's received 3 carries inside the 5-yard line. That's 100% of his team. So if they get down there, he's getting the ball. And Cook from Minnesota, he's received 3 as well. There are 11 other running backs that have received 2 carries inside the 5-yard line. Obviously, I'm factoring all these numbers into my selection of running backs. I also look at the value in the game script. Value is found by taking the salary and dividing it by projected points. Different sites have different projections. I use a couple different ones. They're all pretty similar, but to get that value number, their salary, if they get that if they reach that projected point, you obviously want lower dollars per point. You don't want, if you're spending $8,000 for a running back, you don't want him to score 16 points because that's $4,000, $2,000 per point. You don't want that. So that's how I find value, and I have identified the following running backs this week from the chart that I use, projected points. Clarkson get $337 per point. Fournette followed up, $363 per point. Gallman from the Giants, $366 per point. McCaffrey, $367, and Kerryon Johnson, $375. Those are running backs. If you look at them, that's kind of how I get my value. Value isn't scrolling down and finding the cheapest guy. I used to think that's what it was. It's not. It's value in comparison to their salary. I do like running backs from teams that are favored, as I mentioned, and at home. Those are 2 things that I really like a lot. Favored running backs provide a game script, which is important when building your lineups. For instance, Miami, they're the team to pick on right now this year. They were a huge underdog in Dallas last week. Ezekiel Elliott was a really popular pick. Now, he didn't get value based on his salary, but he was definitely a target. His backup, which was Pollard, actually got the value. A lot of people were concerned that Dallas would get up so far, pull Elliott out of the game, and then you don't have a 3-quarter exposure for Elliott. And that's kind of what happened. Pollard came in, relieved Elliott, had and scored more fantasy points than Ezekiel, mainly because he got in the end zone. And he did have over 100 yards. So you got to watch that when you're picking on teams. And like this weekend in particular, you have Austin Eckler playing against Miami in Miami. They're a 17-point favorite. and he probably will get a majority of the carries. He's getting the carries at the goal line, but you also have Jackson there. And you could see a situation where if they got up enough, they would lean on Jackson, because a lot of Eckler's game is also the receiving game. He's had 12 receptions through 3 games already this year. So if they're up, they're not going to really have to be throwing the ball so much. So maybe they would bring in Jackson and give Eckler some relief. Another scenario that I heard is that Melvin Gordon is reportedly going to be coming back sooner than later, and perhaps they just go ahead and run Eckler in the ground because they know they're going to be using Gordon when he gets back. So those are some things to consider when you're looking at favorites and home favorites. But if they're big home favorites, that's because Vegas thinks they're going to win the game, and eventually the game script gets to the point where they're winning, they're trying to control the clock, and you do that by running the ball. Some favorite running backs at home this week include, well, not just at home, but some favorite running backs. Eckler, which I just mentioned, he's actually a 16-point road favorite. Gurley's at home, a 10-point favorite. Very, very iffy with I don't know what to think of the Gurley situation. He is getting carries, but he's not the Gurley from a couple years back where he's just controlling the games. And he has Brown, who is getting a lot of the carries as well. And actually in the first game this year was getting the goal line carries as well. So Gurley at home as a 10-point home favorite. Sonny Michel, 7-point favorite on the road. You also have Ingram, who's a 7-point favorite at home, and Mack, who's a 7-point favorite at home. Those are some of the running backs that are also found in some of the other statistics that I shared with you. Okay, hopefully you've memorized all this. I'll give you a second to catch up. No, I'm just kidding. But just in case you didn't, I'm going to summarize these and break them down again real quick for you. Number 1 on the player pool list is McCaffrey. He's getting the touches. The matchup is favorable. The offense runs through McCaffrey. And you have Newton, who is out. Kyle Allen doesn't run as much as Newton, and you don't have to worry about Newton vulturing touchdowns down on the goal line like he has done in the past. Austin Eckler getting touches. He has a phenomenal matchup this weekend in Miami. He's getting the red zone carries. He's a favorite, and I already mentioned my concerns with Jackson, but Eckler's definitely going to be in the player pool due to one of the main things is the matchup. Mack from Indianapolis, he's a large percentage of the offense. He's had an extremely high amount of targets in the first 3 games, or touches in the first 3 games. Doesn't get many passes, but he pretty much gets all the rush attempts. The matchup, Oakland's giving up 24.9 points per game to the running back. Mack is in the player pool. Fournette from Jacksonville, he's getting 19 touches per game. Value, he's only $6,000 compared. I mean, McCaffrey's at the top at $8,800, and on paper, you can see that Fournette facing the number 23rd ranked rush defense compared to McCaffrey. I believe McCaffrey is much more valuable in the receiving game, but you can find some value, and that's a way you can differentiate yourself. There'll be a lot of people on McCaffrey this weekend because the choices. Barkley's got the big fat 0 by his name. That means out. And after that, you have Dalvin Cook, which is making a visit to Chicago, and Chicago is known for their defense and shutting down the run game. So that's something to consider. Johnson from Detroit. He's getting a lot of touches. There's value. He's only $5,400. I am worried about the game script, though. If Kansas City does what Kansas City does and starts putting a lot of points on Detroit and running up and down the field, then the Kerryon Johnson running game isn't going to be what gets you back in the game or helps you keep up. They have thrown a few passes to him, so they could use him that way, but you could see a situation where Stafford starts slinging the ball to Galladay and Jones and the new tight end Hawkinson. So, but he does provide value at $5,400. Yeah, $5,400. Next is Henry. He's getting 18. Excuse me. He's getting 18 touches per game. I don't really like the price for Henry, the 6,000, because there's some other running backs in that area. You can go up $100 to Mac at home. Henry is 6,300, and the game script versus Atlanta is if Atlanta now Tennessee's pass defense has been pretty decent, and Tennessee's pass defense has been has been pretty. They've been pretty good the first 3 games, but I'm not sure that Henry's not game script dependent, because if they got behind, if Atlanta was able to put some points on the board, and they're at home, and they have Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, and Hooper's been doing pretty good. They also have Sanu. If they're able to move the ball through the air and put some points on the board, the Henry running game is another example of the running game not being able to put you back in the game. They do have Dion Lewis, who catches passes out of the backfield, and they like to use him in that situation. So you could see a situation where Henry kind of gets phased out of the game. Another one is Jacobs from Oakland. He's going to be in the player pool. The touches aren't there. I mean, he's not in the top echelon of running backs getting touches, but the game script and the fact that Indianapolis is not doing that well against the running back position is something that makes you want to kind of lean to Jacobs. His price is $5,100, and as I mentioned, Indy's giving up 26.9 points per game to the running back position. It's something to think about. Now, they do like to go to Richard out of the backfield to throw the ball, but in closer games, teams will lean on their running game if they have it. And if Indianapolis isn't doing, so far they haven't done as well against the run. If Oakland can keep pace with their running game, they're going to do that. The very first game this year, the Raiders game against Denver, the Raiders were able to pretty much control the game using Jacobs. They only threw him one pass out of the backfield, and it went for 28 yards. But he had over 100 yards rushing, a couple touchdowns, and that game actually put him on the radar moving forward. There was definitely some recency bias in the next couple of games. People went to him, and he is game script dependent. I don't want to say that he's not, but I don't really see a situation in this game where I know Indy's favored by 7 points, but I don't think Jacobs is going to be phased out of this game, and I don't see at Indianapolis running away with the game. So Jacobs is definitely going to be in my player pool, especially at that price. Carson, the matchup is concerning. He's getting a lot of the touches. Arizona, according to the opponent rank, is 18th against the rush right now. Arizona does run a really fast paced offense, which puts more plays into the game. But he's had a fumbling problem, and last week Wilson put the ball in the air quite a bit. So if Arizona is able to do what uh, New Orleans did in taking, put a lot of points on them, and they have to go to Russell Wilson throwing the ball, this is another situation where Carson could be phased out. Um, and again, he is a nice value, and fumbling is kind of an issue right now. And eventually, sometimes head coaches, when they get fed up with that, especially if you have a problem and you get down inside the 5-yard line, and they put someone else in there to vulture the touchdown because you've been putting the ball on the ground. Lastly, McCoy and Williams. I touched on this a few minutes ago. They actually have the second best matchup as far as defense fantasy points per game allowed against Detroit. But I'm concerned because this is a committee, and which means if for instance Detroit is giving up 40 points per game to the running back position, and you're using 2 or 3 running backs, then that gets split up among them, and there's other value. And another thing, Mahomes isn't game script dependent at all. He puts the ball in the air, whether they're up 30 points or up 4 points or down 5 points. He slings the ball all over the place. So they are McCoy's $5,600, definitely a value, but I'm not sure he gets there with the amount of touches that he gets. And if Williams is healthy, he's not going to get value. They might both combine to get value, but you're not going to use 2 running backs from the same team in your lineup. I mean, perhaps you could do it, but the likelihood of outscoring all the other running backs is very slim. Let's see. So these are the running backs that I'm going to have in my player pool. Now, I do reserve the right to change this through the week, and as I've mentioned in my previous videos, when I do my lineup building show on Saturday, we'll revisit this, and if I make any changes, add or subtract, I'll tell you why. Because I'm always looking at the numbers, and if there's any injuries, like right now we only have Barkley out, obviously Gordon's holding out. Kansas City Williams actually has a questionable tag on him, and says he's not going to practice Thursday. Yes, at this stage, it looks like Williams will miss his second straight game this weekend. If that's the case, the Chiefs' Week 4 backfield against Detroit will be led by LaShawn McCoy, who has a little bit of an ankle problem. Assuming he plays after being limited at practice Wednesday, with Darrell Williams and Darwin Thompson in that order next up for touches. So keep an eye on what's going on with McCoy in the practices the next couple of days. I wanted to seen him right here. He's $5,600. Last week, he ran the ball 8 times, had 3 receptions, ran the ball 8 times for 54 yards and 1 touchdown, and caught 3 receptions for 26 yards and another touchdown for 23 fantasy points. 12 of those were touchdowns, and you can't factor that in week in and week out. So there you go. So as I said, we'll review the running backs on Saturday when we're building our lineups. And I want to take the time to thank you for joining me. And if you've been following my videos, I really appreciate it. If you would hit the subscribe button, the like button, and the notification bell, which will notify you when my next video drops, I'd really appreciate it. My next video, I'm going to take a quick look at the Thursday night showdown, and then I'll follow that up with my wide receiver video, and then tomorrow we'll be doing tight ends, defense, special teams. Again, I appreciate you sticking it out with me. Thanks for your attention. I'll be back in a little bit and see you real soon. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports. My name is Ty Patton.